Hi, good afternoon, good morning to some on the West Coast, good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Brenda Morrison, this is Chris Adams, and the rest of the Balancing Act team is with us too today. Thanks for giving us maybe your lunch hour to take a deeper dive into learning to build a simulation and joining us for this three-part series on how to be a sim maker. So we're going to go ahead because we know you all are busy, but we're just so happy to have you. And we just wanted to say from our team just how much respect we have for those of you in public service, and especially those of you in the financial offices and the budget offices and the kind of in the budget public engagement who are just working, we know, your tails off during this time, and we appreciate it. And so just to let you know, we're thinking about you. But because we know your time is at a premium, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to take you through the first couple of slides, and then I'm going to turn it over to my co-founder, Chris Adams. Chris and I are the co-founders of Balancing Act, and this, to be honest, this product came out of two recessions, one in the early 2000s and one, and one in 08, where we had been noodling on this for a long time. The way to communicate and convey the budget and its importance to residents and elected officials, and how to do it effectively. And Chris and I had been had a face-to-face consulting firm for many, many years in public policy, and we always just kept thinking, was there a better way to communicate this, and how could we communicate the budget to more people than those sitting in the room that happened to be there for a budget presentation? So this is the result of that, and here we are today. The team, as you can see, that's us, and there's Chris and me, and I think that picture is getting a little dated, but Chris's hair is always the same color. Mine is never the same color, but his is always constant, so that is good. And then Dan and Peter. Dan's our chief development director, and Peter, who is our director of sales. Some of you talked to them or heard from them over the time. So thanks again. We're just going to go ahead and get started about what we're doing today. So yeah, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about what's going on currently and how Balancing Act and specifically simulations can help you in this challenging time. It's unfortunate and strange, and there's so much fiscal uncertainty, but we feel just like we did in 2003, 2004, and 08 that a simulation is possibly the one of the best ways to help not only elected officials and staff make decisions, but really inform the public about what the services their governments provide. And we're going to help you get started with Balancing Act and all the different features that are available for you today. And what is really special is that we're going to have a charity, Phillips Little, who's a budget supervisor from Montaniska. Okay, may not say this right. Sistana, she's going to correct me when she gets on, Borough School District in Alaska. So she's going to be talking about this. And what I want to just say right off is this is a pretty deep dive into what we do, how to build a simulation. So after you're done with this, you should feel very comfortable and confident in doing this. We're also available just to help you get started. If you need a 15-minute quick onboarding, Chris, myself, other members of our team are always available to help you get started. But this is going to help you kind of think through some of the more advanced features and how to use it. And again, thinking of our current fiscal situation, how you might approach using the simulation now, because it's kind of different than it was 6 months ago. And we've made a lot of modifications, and Chris will be showing that to you. When we were thinking about this, when we were designing this, and just not that long ago, we were the reason the challenges prior to this time was that the budget documents are often long, they're complex, and easy for those of you in that world who've got that skill set to read, but for some of us, boy, the budget document's inaccessible. It's hard, it's complexity. And when the public or even elected officials, they don't all come to the, to the dais with the same amount of knowledge about government, when people get a little resentful when and they don't understand something. And so we feel like if there's complexity and inaccessibility to budget, sometimes it can leave some anger or just some distrust. You all, unlike what we're seeing right now in the federal government, you have to have a balanced budget every year, which means you all, many of you are in charge of making recommendations to your city manager, to elected officials that aren't popular right now. What has to be done? Are you gonna cut program? Are you thinking about maybe not this year, but next year looking to raise some taxes? How are you gonna balance your budget? And there's no doubt that pre-corona and even 6 months ago, a year ago, there's no doubt that there's a new generation of users who expect transparency and participation when it comes to decision making in government. There's no doubt that at this time, there's even more pressure to be transparent as money flows in from the federal government, and people are looking to government for answers right now in a lot of different areas. I'm sure these headlines, some of you, I think they're familiar, some of you maybe they're not as familiar, but these are just some headlines from across the North America right now, just saying, that many of you your budgets are heavily impacted by the COVID-19 budget, and some may not, but it's impacting staff and different programs. There's, as I said, you all know this better than us, but this is what we've been hearing from you, and we're certainly watching this in our own community. Chris and I are located in Denver, and we're watching the city of Denver as well as our school districts just take a pounding from COVID-19. So there's definitely a decline in revenue, but there's also new expenses. How are we going to handle the enforcements, regulations, COVID-19 expenses, public health, which for those of you that are in counties and in states, tended to be, a very small sliver of the budget is now front and center. What should be cut? Is it a program? Should you cut people, which is heartbreaking? New projects, permanent layoff, furlough days. We know here in Denver, I think there's 8 or 10 furlough days. They just had their first one prior to Memorial Day. I suspect a lot of cities were doing that as a way to save money. But as I looked at Denver, those furlough days certainly weren't enough to cover the $180 million gap that's going to occur. And then, as things get better, how do you begin to prepare for recovery? What's the next step? So I'm going to turn this over to my co-founder of Balancing Act, Chris Adams, and he's going to take you through a deeper dive on how to get started in your simulation, how to maybe frame some questions up. He's going to get you through the nuts and the bolts. If you have questions, feel free. I think you've all know how to do this by now, but if you don't, you can raise the hand, you can type a question, or if if it comes to you afterwards, feel free to just drop us an email or give us a call. We're happy to do that as well. So I'm going to turn this over to Chris. And again, thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you at the end. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you, Brenda. As Brenda noted, the pressure to do budget simulation, to be able to frame up these tough trade-offs, show consequences of decisions, really just sort of lay out realistic decisions. It was born of recession. So we started doing, as Brenda said, our Colorado version in 2007. It was a very small project, sort of a labor of love that she and I had. And then the recession hit, and it became something that was very public, and it really, I think, helped the state of Colorado to communicate with residents and get good input on how to make some tough decisions. This quote right here is one of my favorite quotes. It's from a guy named Benedict Jimenez, who studied those local governments that did well and that didn't do well in terms of recovery from the previous recession, the Great Recession, 2008, 2000 to 2012 or so, depending on where you are. And the big takeaway that he found was that in participatory cities, nothing is off the table when dealing with a fiscal crisis. And so by investing in means to communicate and work with your residents, or even internally with staff and stakeholders and elected officials, that having a way for budget people to communicate in a realistic way and a focused way, it actually gives you all sorts of options and alternatives that you may not have had. Sometimes the options and alternatives are not great, but they are what they are. And having a simulation can help you to work with various stakeholder groups to come up with the best solution, and hopefully one that's the most supported, and hopefully prepare you to move on to recovery. We created Balancing Act essentially as a public engagement tool. That's our history as a company, and we've had some great success. San Jose is one of those, one of them, one of the largest cities in the country, in the U.S. They have been working with us for 3 years now. They do a terrific job in terms of using the tool to explain. They've got a little bit of a structural deficit that they need to work with each year, and they've used the tool to sort of frame those up for people and to sort of get some good input and some buy-in on some directions moving forward. We've got some other examples. This is actually a TV station in Norfolk, Virginia. And that city is not dealing with a structural deficit, but their elected officials had some goals of expanding some things like, non-sexy things like stormwater improvements, and fuller funding of pensions and a few other things. And so they wanted to have an increase of about $19 million of spending. And so that city went through a very nicely done online engagement process with their residents, where they engaged, 1,000, 1,500 people the first year to sort of learn about what was in the budget, to sort of see where these new proposed improvements would fit and how much they cost, and then to see if they would have a corresponding willingness to increase their property tax rates a little bit. So they did that, and as I said, it came up to about $19 million in terms of the increase they wanted. And so the city manager proposed a budget that had a $19 million increase, and they were expecting there to be terrible blowback. On the day of the hearing, as you can see, this is a screenshot from a local TV. The TV anchor put Balancing Act on a big touch screen and said, okay, if you don't like the city manager's proposed tax increase, let's zero that out. And so he zeroed it out, and they said, you tell the city manager what you don't want to do. And so that evening at the budget hearing, the budget director was expecting an unpleasant situation, an angry group of residents. And he said about 6 people came, and they went up to the mic and they said, we don't like taxes. And then they left, and everybody felt as though they'd done a great job with sort of working through the need for this and presenting it to people in a way that they could understand. And it went through really without a hitch and with a high degree of public support. And I know that might not be something that you all are thinking about doing now, but as you think about moving forward, you probably will inevitably be faced with either cutting some services that might be popular, or with proposing some type of a tax increase. And I know that that's going to look different for each entity. But Balancing Act, once again, just going back to that quote, that in a city that, or in a local government that invests in interaction and participation, it gives you more options. All right. And the other thing it does is it creates a sense of empathy. That you're making tough choices. And so I love this quote. This is from Dominic Casey. He's the city manager of Roseville, California. Roseville won the GFOA Award for Excellence last year for their Engage Roseville project. And essentially that they just used it to have a frank discussion with residents about what they wanted from government, and they explained that they had a structural deficit, and they asked residents what they wanted to do about it. And essentially what the city manager found was that it gave him the ability to have a much more productive, fact-based conversation. And people understood how hard it is to make these decisions. And that was in a relatively good time. The times moving forward, at least for the next year, 2, 3 years, are going to be quite a bit rougher. And so to have the ability to let people sit in your shoes, sit in your seat, stand in your shoes, to mix my metaphors, can be a very valuable thing in terms of how you move forward. And this also holds with internally with staff as well. We've seen that when more junior staff or even senior staff get a chance to see the impact of various decisions on other parts of the budget, that they tend to be much more reasonable and more productive and more willing to possibly give on something that they care about because they see that there's a greater need someplace else. And that's actually a nice segue to Charity Phillips Little, who's the budget supervisor at Matanuska-Susitna Borough School District in Alaska. They've been working with some constrained budgets for a while, in part due to just the Alaska state economy. But she's been one of the stars, I think, in terms of building a budget simulation and use it internally. So I'm going to turn it over to her now and let her just give a sense. It's often very useful to hear from peers about how they've used the simulation and what some of their results have been. So, Charity, I hope that you're on.
I am. Thank you very, very much. And it is the Matanuska-Susitna Borough School District. So you guys were
okay. Thank you.
Awfully close, but not quite. And I just want to give a shout out to Melissa Batts, who was my co-partner in doing all of this. She is moving on to wonderful, wonderful things with her and her family, so she's not here today. But it was not just me; it was us as a team. And to give you a little bit of an idea of what our district is, we're a district just north of Anchorage. We're about the size of West Virginia. We have 47 schools that range in size from under 20 to over 1,600. And we've got a student population of 19,080, and our budget is this year it's about $235 million. And we do look at a structural deficit pretty much every year. We're doing really good this year, but we went ahead and implemented Balancing Act. We were really, really excited to this, but is there a way for me to move to the next slide? I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, you're just gonna have to tell me. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, no, that's fine. So we used it internally this year. We're looking forward to finding ways to expand on our use for FY22, our planning for FY22. But we did it in our principals meetings, and we took it to our principals, and we did it for our student advisory board. The student advisory board I'm going to touch on very briefly because that was mostly a learning exercise. And you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. So one of the biggest things that we did when we set all of this up was we based it on our focus. What information did we really want to know? What were we really looking for? What was our question? And then we tailored the scenarios that we presented around that information. So for the student advisory board, we really just wanted to kind of foster an awareness of all of the moving parts of the budget and what our budget constraints were. So 83 to 85% of our budget is staffing, and we have several bargaining units, and the only way that we can adjust those numbers is through adjustments in staffing, in FTE. We can't reduce pay, we can't adjust. That all has to be done in the negotiated agreements. 4% of our budget is utilities. Yes, there are some cost maintaining measures that we can implement, and we have implemented, but those are sort of set costs. And then 4% are contracts and things like that that we have signed, we're locked into, and we have to pay. And then 9 to 10% of that is other non-personnel discretionary accounts, site-based budgets for departments and schools and things of that nature. And so really there's not a lot of wiggle room in our budget unless we want to reduce staff. We've got 10% that we can play with, but even that is, you still have to have paper, you still have to have mileage reimbursements if staff travel. You have to have printers, although, you know, now with COVID and everything that's going on, it's a little bit, do you really, can we do everything with electronic? But we were already moving that direction, but you still have the cost of maintaining your computer and refreshing your computers and things like that. So for the principals, what we were looking for is we wanted to know is how we are allocating their funds and their staffing. Is that meeting their needs? So our staff is based on a per pupil metric. Our non-personnel budgets are based on a per pupil metric. And so a lot of what we do is scalable, and we can adjust it as needed. Now there are some things that fall outside of the metrics, but really we wanted to know if this was something that was meeting their needs. So you can go, oh, and actually before you go on to the next slide, I'm sorry, I did a screenshot. So anywhere that we had something that was locked down, like our salaries and benefits, those are set costs based on our negotiated agreements. And then we gave them the option to add or reduce FTE to change those numbers, but the overall salaries, they can't mess with, because that's what it is. And so we made an effort to make note when things were locked that this is what this includes, this is why it's locked. If you want to make adjustments to this category, that's where you could do it. So now you can go back to the next slide. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So, like I said, we locked down our salaries and benefits. We locked down our SPED teachers and our SPED aides, because there's not, due to maintenance of effort, we have to maintain those. The same with our itinerant FTE. School budgets, those are set by law. They get their portion of the revenue that we receive. And so those were locked. Utilities, yet again, were locked. Contracts were locked. But on the staffing side, like I said, we allowed them to make adjustments to per pupil and to custodial staff, to activity stipends or activity budgets. And yet again, there's supplies and materials. We really, like I said, we wanted to see what they would do with their funding based on the information that we had. And we did allow for the adjustment to certain revenues. The state funding is locked down. That requires an act of law to change. The local funding, we gave them the option to adjust the millage rate, because that is something that we can request. And then our use of fund balance was the other thing that we allowed them to change. And then, but that we allowed minimally, because that has always been something that we don't have a whole lot of for the most part. So if you want to go to the next slide, one of the really interesting things that came out of the principals meeting was we split it into elementary principals and we split it into secondary principals. And the elementaries were class size, class size, class size. We have to reduce our class size. They were willing to, if class size maintained the same, they would sacrifice their non-personnel budgets to for additional tutor advisors and classroom aides and things of that nature. They would be willing to reduce their classified staff if they could reduce their smaller, or if they could reduce their class sizes and get more teaching staff. One of the other things that was asked for all over the place was for counselors or a school psychologist at our elementary schools, because we don't offer that at the moment. So those were the big highlights for the elementary. The secondary, they wanted to add more class periods. We have a 7-period school day. and they wanted to take a look at the possibility of adding 0-hour or 8-hour classes. They didn't feel like they needed as many classroom aides and tutor advisors, and they wanted a reduction in their non-personnel accounts for activities, whether that was their activity budget or whether that was their activity stipends. And these were all things that we didn't necessarily have a way to get at the data in a large group where it was all together prior to Balancing Act. And it also allowed the principals to take a look at, yet again, what the constraints are around the budget and why we can't just give them everything that they ask for. So it did create a lot of empathy between the instruction side of the house and the business services side of the house. And that was something that that we did with the student advisory board as well. A lot of the comments were, this is hard and this is so frustrating, and why can't we just what do you mean it has to balance to zero? That was one that it was very, very eye-opening for our student advisory board. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what a student advisory board is, it is a board of leadership students that meet frequently to discuss their needs and their wants as students. And then there is a president of the student advisory board is also a non-voting member of our school board, and they report back to the school board on the needs and wants of the students. So that was a really interesting thing to be able to take it into the schools for that, and as an education wise. And I think that is my last slide. So if you have any questions, my information was on that first slide for the Matanuska-Susitna Borough School District. Please feel free to shoot me an email. It was very, very interesting getting to use this as an internal tool to gather information. It was incredibly useful, and it was just the amount of data that we were able to pull, especially by tailoring it to each group that we gave it to, was very, very useful in moving forward into the budget for FY21. So thank you guys very much.
And thank you to Charity for sharing your experiences, and we're glad that you had a good experience. You know, as Brenda said earlier, we created this as a public engagement tool, but we're realizing that in the relatively early phases of a financial crisis, that using it internally may have more application and might be more useful. We did a very, very large webinar that had more than 900 people with GFOA about 7 weeks ago, when it first became clear how deep of a financial crisis this was going to be. And they did a snap poll where they asked, budget directors and finance people, do you have more heartburn in thinking about the tough decisions to come when dealing with the public or dealing internally with staff and elected officials? And by a 3-to-1 margin, they said internally. And so that told us that we needed to sort of further develop our use case and make some changes to the software to accommodate that. But Matanuska-Susitna has been well ahead of folks there, and so they're actually it's a nice to see what they've done and learn from that. We work with county, cities, districts of all kinds, but as I said, school districts have been particularly ready to make use of the tool internally. And so I want to quickly show you a slide. This is Syracuse, New York. This is the CFO, Suzanne Slack. We asked her to reflect on some of the things that she's been seeing with regards to using Balancing Act, both internally and externally with the public. This is actually a noticed public meeting. This is their school board up here in the upper left. But here are some of the things that she said is that when staff and department staff got to see how much items cost, that actually tempered how much they sort of insisted on certain things, and when they understood what the trade-offs and the things that would have to be sacrificed in order to do the things that certain people were asking for. Another thing is that they found is that she has found that it was easier to have these conversations, that when people understand a budget decision and when they get a chance to express what their preference is, whether they get their way or not, they actually feel better about it, and there's more ownership of it. And you'll probably be asking your staff and electeds to do some hard things. And so even if they're bad choices or choices that they don't want to make, they're probably the choices that need to be made, and you want them to be committed to them. And then the last thing that she said is that it definitely gave us leverage to make changes. And in particular, she was talking about the board here, that it sort of empowered the board because the board felt like it had good informed information. It made it possible for them to make some hard choices that would have been much harder to do without. So I want to talk to you a little bit. We know from the comments that some of you made when you were registering that you really kind of want to see what Balancing Act can do. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how to get started on it. And then if anybody wants to leave at that point, you can. But for anybody who's interested in some research and some recommendations about budget simulations, we'll spend another 5 minutes or so on that. All right. So Balancing Act is essentially two tools. The one on the left is our simulation tool, and that's the most commonly used one, and it's being used in a lot of different ways right now. That's the one that Charity was referring to. And then more popular probably in cities and counties is what we call our taxpayer receipt, which provides a way of estimating taxes and that an individual pays, and then showing what it pays for. And we'll talk about both of those. We'll talk about taxpayer receipt in the next week or the week after. I'm not sure when we have that slated. But once you have your simulation, it's actually quite easy to create the taxpayer receipt, and we'll talk to you about that. Sign of the times is that when we also saw that how serious this recession was going to be, we modified the simulation so that it could more easily accommodate solving for a cut figure. I just got off a phone call with the CFO earlier today, and he's calling it we need help figuring out how to fill the gap, so a gap budget tool. And so in this case, we've removed the pie charts and just made it a little bit simpler, so you can say, okay, we need to cut $8 million, and then down here are some options for doing it. Often what shows up on this, as Charity was talking about, is personnel costs are the biggest portion, and so it often looks at things like furloughs and layoffs and salary and wages and so forth. And so this view is now available through Balancing Act. We've also made it possible more recently to customize what people see when they come into the simulation. You can add your logo or brand. You can add a video if you want. You can do all sorts of things like that. You can also collect information. So you can ask them multiple choice questions. You can also have people drop a pin near where they live, so you can have a geographic sense of where your respondents are coming from. And these are all things that we'll show you probably in the next week in terms of setting them up. It's pretty easy. This idea of using it internally, we had done it before. Mostly we've done it in face-to-face settings, which is not really possible anymore, so we'll give that the big X. But Balancing Act has what we call meeting mode, so it's a way to use it in a face-to-face meeting, or even a real-time online meeting, where you can let people sort of play with the simulation, and then everyone else in that meeting can see what they said. And if there's interest in that, we can talk a little bit about that as well. We did a whole webinar session on how to use meeting mode under social distancing. This is meeting mode in a different setting. This is a community meeting. This is with the city of Kansas City, and just, the idea is that people get to create a special URL for just a particular meeting, and then you can see the results. Everyone in that meeting can see the results, and you can see people going through that here. A nice quote over here about how seriously people take these decisions. It was interesting when Charity was talking. She said people realize this is really hard. And we don't want necessarily to make people go through hard things that aren't meaningful, but where that empathy begins is where people, realize how hard these budget decisions are, the ones that budget finance people and top administrators, managers, and electeds make all the time, to sort of convey to people how hard that is. And what we found is that when people have the opportunity that when in a simulation, they actually experience how hard it is, and it just makes things easier to solve the problems. This is what our analytics module looks like. We give you lots and lots of information. This shows a nice distribution where sort of the different types of input and different ways of calculating averages sort of mirror each other. We'll talk about analytics next week a little bit. This is a new feature that we have coming on board. We think it's going to be particularly useful as you begin to think about recovery. It allows you to show impact of budget decisions both on the current year, and then also you can calculate some impact on a future year, such as how the capacity, or how much of your rainy day fund you're using, or some other measure of fiscal sustainability. And so we're thinking that this should be very useful moving forward as well. All right, so let's get to the maker part of the Sim Maker workshop. So first, if you haven't done so already, please create a trial account. We were one of the very first companies to create a very significant COVID relief offer. We have been making our product available for free from March until July, and that's still available if anybody wants to take advantage of that. I know that some of you on this workshop did sign up for that, and you're here to learn a little bit more and go a little bit deeper on how to use the tool. But please do create an account, and we're going to try to, it'd be nice if we kind of walk through this stepwise. I know that everybody's calendar doesn't always allow that, but the idea of the simulation is that as you continue to build it, you can maybe consult colleagues and consult those of us here at Balancing Act on how to handle certain things or some best practices as we go. So please do take advantage of creating a free trial account if you'd like to try it out. And you can do that on our website, abalancingact.com. On the lower right, there's a place to do sign up, or you can also contact one of us, and we'll be glad to get you set up with an account. Charity gave a brilliant use case for what we call the 3 C's. So we've been doing this now for, about 12 or 13 years. And we tried to boil down what we think it makes a simulation work well. And it just so happens that they all three begin with C. So constraints, context, and consequence. And so, constraints are important to convey because there are certain things that you need to obey that you can do, that certain monies can only be used towards certain things. COVID funds, for example, can't be used for anything. They can only be used for some things, and Charity mentioned that. And then the most important and the most obvious constraint is that spending can't exceed revenue. And so just keeping that in mind as probably most of your budgets are going to be shrinking for next year and this year, that's an important constraint to convey, and maybe, just the bottom line one that needs to be shared with folks. The second is context. And, sharing with people why an item is important. So Brenda was talking about the progression in local government finance between, sort of everybody kind of getting on board with transparency. Yes, let's make data available, whether it's a PDF that people can download and look through, or whether it's a really nice visualization. But one of the problems with that was that it didn't have context. It doesn't always describe what an item is, or why an item is important, or why an item costs a certain amount. And so in Balancing Act, we've got these opportunities for blue info icons everywhere, where you can describe what an item is. You can give in more information. You can provide links. You can actually, if you are a government entity that has a visualization, a data site, you can actually pop your data visualizations right into Balancing Act so that people can sort of see the data next to the line item and sort of help get a sense of what's going on and why an increase is warranted, or why a decrease might be warranted, or why things should stay the same, et cetera. And also just, give a history of an item, and just kind of give you more of a sense of what something is. And then the third C is consequence. So if you do cut an item, that there is a corresponding impact, usually in service level, to help balance the different trade-offs between different spending items, to balance the trade-offs between all spending items and available revenue, that you want to show people what the consequence is. So just like the CFO from Syracuse was saying, that you can't just say, I want this, I want this, I want this, that if you want that means something's got to give. And so simulation can convey that to people, and once again, just frames the conversation in a realistic way, and in a way that lends itself much more to problem solving. Okay, so the first thing in terms of doing a budget simulation is to identify goals. And I know that some people sort of do things, like a go, ready, get set, and that's fine too. You can sort of back into these. A budget manager I just talked to yesterday sort of did that. But we even if you just dive right into the simulation, you've probably got a sense of what your goals are. But in terms of just thinking about what is it that you wish your residents knew about your financial condition? So once again, thinking about those constraints, how do you want to convey to people that there's a limited amount of money and that you need to make some choices, how much things cost, how much services cost, wanting to get some specific feedback on certain things. There's a school district that I know of right now that's really trying to evaluate whether or not it should continue with its COLA, with its cost of living adjustment. And maybe that's something that needs to have some input both among staff when they see how tight the budget is, and it might even be something that the public needs to weigh in on. And then also to look at what the goal is. Is it just transparency? Because the Balancing Act is actually a very good transparency tool, but it's transparency plus participation, and we think that's where the real value is. And so to think about what is it that you want to convey with regards to transparency and participation. Another question is what year. So it used to be, that we would be looking most often at the next year's budget during budget formulation. This year, a lot of folks are using it to cut the budget. School district that I just talked to is trying to cut $60 million, and it's no fun. And so to figure out what year it is that you want to work on, and then also in many places, California, Colorado, Washington. If you do need to have a tax increase, that you need to have popular support for certain types of tax increases, and so it might be that you need to sort of indicate that certain services can only be accomplished if there were to be a positive vote by the people, whether it's a bond or whether it's authority to raise a tax or something like that. All right. There should be on your GoToWebinar screen, there should be a place where you can get some handouts. There's a bunch of stuff over there. There's some scholarly articles. There's some handouts and things that you might want to think about. It's all sort of useful in terms of getting going, and feel free to download those. And we've got more and more on our website if you go to abalancingAct.com/learn. All right, so now let's talk about actually building your simulation. This is where I hope that some of you will have some time over the next week between now and next Wednesday when we have our second Makers Workshop to really get started with your budget. So there's basically 5 different types of information in Balancing Act. So there's the category, in this case, it's public safety, subcategory, in this case, it's police, and then subcategory amount, in this case, it's $254 million. And then you've got optional context. And so this blue info icon right here, we call this more info. And that's where you can put, usually kind of a shortish text narrative description, maybe, 30, 40 words. You can do longer than that, but it starts to look a little bit weird if you go too much longer than that. And then there's what we call more details. And more details allows you to put in all sorts of things, links and so forth. And we're going to talk about how you build those and even how you select those next week. But just to let you know what the 5 basic pieces of data are. And then to think about what are your categories. So what makes a good category? And I'll just tell you that most of the time people just use their departments and it corresponds with the budget book. But we've seen some really successful efforts where people have done things a little bit differently, where they have tried to break it out functionally and to present the budget that way. Or there's a number of entities that are doing budgeting for outcomes where they've aligned programs and expenses towards a certain goal or an outcome. And I think that actually makes a lot of sense to the public. So it's not just that you're spending money on police. You're actually, what you're spending money on is to be a safe city or a safe county. And so it's a very nice way of doing it. If your budget lends itself to that, we think it's a really good practice. And we also encourage you to use as few as you need. So a few of our folks that have taken advantage of our free offer have really, they've kind of taken a fairly large data extract from their budgeting software and they put it into Balancing Act. And you can do that. It looks really long. And I think that if you're thinking strategically about what it is that you want from your stakeholders, whether it's staff, electeds, or the public, it's not to let them interact with every single line item. It's to kind of frame up what's important for them to think about. So use your category selection as a way to kind of frame that. The next item down is the subcategories, and this is important. This is the point of interaction. We're going to talk about scenario questions next week. That you can sort of ask, a specific question with regards to an item that is on the budget and ask about different service levels, et cetera. So the subcategories, once again, if you can make them relatable and understandable to people, that's a very valuable thing. And then once again, providing context and explanation, because what might seem obvious to you is not going to be obvious to everybody else. And then the revenue categories. Once again, people often ask, is just my general fund? Can we include revenues and services paid for out of other funds? And we've never heard a complaint from a resident yet that the funds were combined. So what we encourage you to do is to create the simulation in such a way that it's relatable and understandable to citizens, to residents, and if you need to combine funds, I don't think that's a problem at all. City of Kansas City was one of our first clients. It wasn't until we'd been working with them for about a year and a half that I had a chance to have a face-to-face conversation with our budget director. And he said, you probably didn't know that there's 36 different funds rolled up into our revenue side. And really, he only had about 3 categories. And what he was doing was he was thinking strategically about how to present a budget. You don't need to give overwhelming detail. You just need to account for things. And so we encourage you not to use too many. We also give you the ability to lock any category that you want, any subcategory that you want. And I think that's a fine thing to do. And when people are a little bit touchy about taxes, I think it makes a lot of sense. Or maybe there's an item like a bond payment that really isn't up for debate. Certainly use it in those instances. But what we found is that educating people about why you can't do certain things is more effective than using the lock technique. In some ways, that makes you feel like you're hiding stuff. So we encourage you to use all the various educational features, the warnings and alerts that we have that I'll show you next week, instead of just locking down categories. But you can do it if you want. Okay, so getting data in. So I think this is where I am going to go to my live website and show you around. So everything starts on our client management area. And let me take you to a live version of that. This is the client management area. On the left, you've got a dashboard. I won't go into these right now too much. And then you've got simulations, you've got analytics. This is where the great visualizations pop up. This is meeting mode. This is where you control the meeting function, and this is where you build your taxpayer receipt. So for today, we're going to focus on creating a simulation. So I'm going to just show you one real quick here, because I'm going to refer back to it, and I think it'll be useful. So once again, it's interesting. We've got 2 examples from Alaska. This is the mayor of the Fairbanks North Star Borough in Alaska. I think in some ways they've got a lot to teach the rest of the country, because as a state they've been in a recession for a while now, and they're finding ways to deal with it. And a lot of them have come to balancing act to do that. But essentially, you have an opportunity here to customize a message here. You can put in a video, and it doesn't need to be a hard video. As you can see, this was probably shot on an iPhone, and it's just the mayor talking into the video. Then they have a couple screenshots. Very simple to do. And then, but you can also put in your logo. You can put in kind of whatever you want right here. Then if you continue through it, you can ask a couple of questions. Are you satisfied with city services? You can say very, somewhat. You can ask for people's email address if you'd like. And then down here, this is what, as I mentioned earlier, this is our drop a pin feature. It's a really nice way of getting a geographic sense of where your respondents are coming from without asking them for their address, which many of them won't give you. And so I'll just put in my zip code here in Denver, and then I click on this, and then it pulls up a map that's kind of centered around that zip code, and I can zoom in if I want. And then the request here is just to just to position the map kind of where you live. So if I go over here and I just click on that, I don't live exactly there, but I kind of live in here. And this is going to then write the longitude and latitude of the CSV. So if you're using software, ArcGIS software, you can actually then correlate responses with the geography. If you're not, we still give you a visualization, a map that just shows a pinpoint on where everybody who responded put their stuff. And we're going to say continue, and then balancing act once again in that spirit of the 3 C's. Major constraint is that you can't spend more money than you have. Down here, you've got context with the blue info icons, etc. And then you've got the consequences of making a choice. And so this is an example of the police department. You can just click it up. You can reduce it. These are the simplest types of questions. We call these the plus minus questions. And then scenario questions we'll talk about next week. Okay, now, and then revenue over here. Now I'm going to go back to my simulation, and I'm going to show you how to get data in. And so let's see here. There's basically 3 methods. Popping back to my PowerPoint, you can import it, you can add it manually, or if you're a user of Questica Budget, which is a major provider of budget software for government, or Casebook, which is a great tool to make the budget. There's a company called FH Black that has created an API connection with them. You can actually just connect an API connection directly to Balancing Act. But it's really pretty easy. What we recommend is to start by getting your information into a CSV and then pull it in and then make your adjustments. So the structure of the file that you want to use is very simple. So you've got your category, your subcategory, and your amount here. And so category can be repeated multiple times with a unique subcategory, and then you put the amount. And then if you want to have your more info and more details, you just throw it right in here, and then Balancing Act pulls it in. So let me go back to the simulation now, to the live simulation. So we're going to say test for makers, and we're going to choose the language. We've got quite a few languages here. It's pretty easy to do. And then we're going to say start from scratch. And so I'm going to say continue. And then it's going to create a shell of the simulation that I can then begin populating with data and begin to put some more stuff on. So we're going to add our revenue categories first. So you can download the revenue template here. I'm just going to go ahead and pull one in that I've already started just for the sake of time. So this is a revenue import. It's very simple. I think it has about 10 lines on it. So it's got a line for taxes, sales and real estate, fines, parking, and traffic. And then I'm going to go over to spending, and I'm going to pull in something that looks pretty similar to the example I just showed you. And it's got police, operations, detention, and then that civilian staff question that we'll talk about next week in terms of how to make that into a scenario question. And it's got parks and recreation, fire, etc. So now I've basically just built a basic simulation. So we can see the simulation we just built. And it doesn't have anything customized here, which is fine. We can just sort of skip through that. And it doesn't have too much that's fancy. It doesn't have the info icons or anything. But you can open it up and, actually, okay, I did create a scenario question there. And you can see you've got operations, and so you can increase that. You can click on this and see a description includes enforcing laws. And over here, it has just a little bit of history. Once again, this is an area where you could put in a visualization, kind of whatever you want to have. And then you've got parks and recreation, and then you've got taxes over here, sales tax, real estate tax. And next week, we'll talk about some things that you can do to change this. So the increment adjust by rate versus total. There's a few nice little customizations that you can do with that. So I think that was essentially it. I did want to just show you that once you get things in, and this is what we're going to talk about next week, is that you've got the ability to go over here to these pencils and click on a pencil, and then you have then you can change things and add more context or edit if you wish. And so going back to the live one, say that I wanted to add a little bit more context to the civilian staff. I could say some police believe it is effective to have non-sworn officers take police reports. And then if I wanted, I could put in a link down here to it, or I could put in a picture, or I could even drop in a visualization if I wanted, say on police response time, that kind of thing. So I'm going to say done. And I think that's really it for, at least that's most of what we wanted to talk about during this session. We're going to do a lot more sort of in the way of fine tuning and adding context next week. But just in terms of just advice, sort of accumulated wisdom is, I would bet that everyone on this call knows too much about your budget, that you know far, far too much. And that you shouldn't think that because you know so much that you need to convey that to everybody else. So thinking about your audience. So if it's, the staff of the city, most of them are not going to be budget professionals, but they would, if it were framed up to them, they might be able to provide some useful input on what a priority should be or a level of service. Same with residents. Most of them are not going to be budget professionals. They're not going to devote anywhere near the amount of time that you have to building a budget, writing a budget book, understanding all the different nuances. And they don't really need to. They don't need to become you in order to provide some high-level input that would make them feel more attached and engaged, that can then help you make some of these hard decisions. So just remember, you know too much, and that everyone doesn't need to know as much as you. We really encourage you to use the structure of the simulation to put the discussion at the right level. As I said, we've had a few folks that that kind of started on their own, which is just fine, and they just went ahead and uploaded, about 30 or 40 different categories, and it just makes a really long vertical scroll. And I just don't think it's useful because you're not going to have anybody. I don't think any member of the public, I don't even think a staff member is going to want to go through it every line. And believe me, I don't think you want them to either. So try to keep it as limited as you can. Think about rolling things up. That's going to be the challenge in terms of getting your content together, is rolling things up and combining items, and then trying to draw out those areas that really need the most input from you. Once again, just thinking about framing a conversation with the public. So that's really it. I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions. I know that it's always awkward to ask questions on these types of simulations, and maybe Brenda, if I can't see the questions. If there are any, read them to me if any were submitted in writing. Otherwise, we will sort of go to something else.
No, I don't see any questions, but we do want to encourage you. We know some of you have started your simulations. We've seen some of them, and that is terrific. So if you could go ahead and if you haven't started, if you have, go ahead and do some fine tuning. Like Chris said, maybe roll up some categories if you put in everything, if it's really long. Add in the information that Chris mentioned earlier. Ask us. You can just email us, and if you want feedback, we're happy to give you feedback on your first cut. Anything else, Chris, on that?
I don't think so. If there's no questions about sort of building the simulation or about anything I've said before, not that I want people to get kicked off, but if you have a few more minutes and are interested in just learning about some of the research and recommendations, especially out of GFOA, I was going to go through that, which it's totally optional. I know some people love that kind of thing, and some people, it makes their eyes glaze over. That's why we put it here at the end. So unless there's another question, I'm just going to take about 5 more minutes and talk about what we've been learning from the simulation. So we've got about, let's see, oh, sorry, getting ready for next week. I should have had this slide up. Like I said, create your trial account, think about what you want your categories and subcategories to be, and then try to enter your data just by downloading that CSV template, super simple, and then popping it right back into Balancing Act. And we're here to help. Send us a note. Our address is on our website. Everybody's Chris at balancingact.com, Brenda at balancingact.com, Peter, etc. We're easy to find. Give us a call, and we'd be glad to help. All right, so here are the latest recommendations and research about on budget simulation. So in December, so about 6 months ago, GFOA published the Guide to Online Financial Transparency, and it was the culmination of about 18 months of work. And once again, it's this idea of thinking through transparency has been accomplished in North American governments. Everybody can at least get a PDF with almost all the data, unless there's fraud, which really doesn't happen that often. But transparency has really been reasonably accomplished. Some do visualization, some don't, but it's been sort of good. But what they've recommended then is that you need to sort of move. This is one of those magic quadrant graphs where you kind of want to be in this upper right. So on the left axis here is educate, on the right axis is inform. And so they're saying, you want to, these are the things you don't want to do. You don't want to have data that's not searchable. You don't want to show what constraints are. Budget simulations are not available. And then these are the things that you do want to do: searchable data, let people know about constraints, provide a budget simulation. That they're really not that hard to do anymore. They're not that expensive because there's really nice cloud-based software that can do it for you, and so forth. These are this is actually the recommendation. So they're saying GFOA recommends use of simulation, allow opportunities to participate, integrate transparency with that participation, provide context, let people drill down to detail as they wish, control the options, another way of saying constraints, to keep it simple as you can, and also to be flexible. This is actually the cover of the GFOA from about 2 years ago, and it has an article by Mark Mack, who's a consultant at GFOA, and myself, talking about the history of budget simulation, of public engagement, really, on the budget. And the point is that there are really poor ways of doing budget engagement. Surveys I'm going to say surveys being probably the worst because they don't convey constraints, they don't provide consequence, and they don't provide context. And the simulations can do that. Up until now, SurveyMonkey, an online tool, has been sort of a popular way for people to say, how much do you love, having your trash picked up? How much do you love having, the parks clean? How much do you love having snow removed from your streets, et cetera? And everybody says, yes, we love all those things, but it didn't include cost. It didn't include the trade-offs. It didn't show the context of all the different things the government was doing, and it had no relationship to the revenue stream. So simulations are just much, much better than that. We'll probably be sending out an article in the next couple weeks from American City and County that talks about some research that just talks about the shortcomings of budget surveys, of understanding budget preferences, and talks about simulations as a nice alternative for that. Some of the new research that's coming out, I can't remember if I mentioned, we've got about 40 local government researchers that are part of the Balancing Act Research and Education Consortium, and they're just beginning to turn out some really nice articles that are helping to understand what the benefits are of doing budget simulation. And so one part of some of the things I was just saying about simulations that actually comes out of that research. But what they're finding, and this is maybe a key finding, maybe it's sometimes social science just tells you definitively something obvious. But what they're finding is that people actually are smart enough to figure out that you don't get something for nothing. Maybe you think about the taxpayer that's just disconnected and just wants everything. And what they're claiming is that that's what a survey does, is that when you just ask people all the things they love, they're going to say we love all of them. And if you ask them which taxes they love, they're going to say none of them. And what a simulation does that ties the two things together, and that's what they're claiming, is that that's when you get the better information, and that actually undercuts the belief that some researchers have, and I would think some in government have, that people just want something for nothing. That when people actually are given both sides of the equation with a little bit of explanation, and that just shows the logic of some of the choices that are being made of why the budget is the way it is now, that people are actually okay with it, and that's a really powerful thing. And to me, that's where we all need to be as we think about recovering from the current situation. This is just a top line from that same study that as I said before, that citizens actually can make some of these trade-offs, that they take a balanced approach, that it's not just a mad rush to cut everything. That's actually, we rarely see that. It's also just not a mad rush to increase everybody's taxes, because ideologically some people might be more in favor of having a strong government, that people are actually quite nuanced and reasonable in ways that I would think you all are as public administrators. And then the last thing is that, and this was sort of unexpected, and we've got some researchers that are going to delve into this a little bit more, is that people are finding that people who come in with strong ideological preferences, for big government, little government, lots of services, very little services, low taxes, high taxes, that when they actually are faced with real choices, that those ideological differences fade away, and it's more about how do we allocate our financial resources to get the community that we want. And to me, that's just a breath of fresh air. I don't know where the rest of you are, but I think that having local governments be able to have that conversation that's not so ideological and more about what we want and what we're willing to pay for is a good place to be. And then there's also some good evidence that we're going to do a little bit more research on that, or they're going to do a little bit more research on that, is that by having this understanding of revenue and spending, even by just spending a little bit of time going through a simulation, that you actually narrow that gap between that in terms of trust in government, and I think that's a valuable thing as well. So that's it for us, and for those of you who made it through all of this, congratulations. We love to talk about this. If anybody wants to chat, give us a call. If you want some help setting up your simulation, we'd love to help you with that. We think moving forward with the immediate issues of in many instances, making cuts to the current year budget, very painful ones, making the budget for next year, which is probably going to be a substantial portion smaller than it is this year, that the budget simulation can be a very helpful tool internally with the public, with electeds, to frame up the right questions and to have fact-filled conversations. And we also think with that quote about participatory cities had more options and fared better, we think that's the case too. And so we think this is the time to begin to have that participation and relationship with your residents and your stakeholders, so that you can make the best choices and come out of this on the right side. So it looks like there might be one question, and I'm not sure if I'm able to. Oh, it looks like it was an answered question. Okay. All right. Well, that's really it. Oh, and there's one more question. There's one question there. Let's see if I can find it. Brenda, I don't know if you're still there, but if you can see the question.
Can you answer the question that somebody they want to create a second simulation? This is from Corinne, where they use the same template that they've already started. That's the question. Can I create a second simulation where I use the same one as the first template?
Sure. So the terminology, it could mean a couple different things. So the easy thing to do is if you've created a simulation and you want to make changes to it, or you want to just try something a little bit different, this may answer your question, is that you can just go to the simulations page and you can go up here to create simulation, and you can say that you want to duplicate it. So you just choose the one that you want, you give it a new name, and then you say, I want to duplicate it, and then you duplicate the one that you wanted. And if that answers your question, then that's great. If it doesn't answer your question, and it really is about the CSV, you can import the same CSV into a new, fresh, start from scratch simulation. So I hope that one of those two things was the question you were answering. And if not, give us a call and we'll help you with it.
Yeah, Corinne, we'll give us a call and we'll walk you through that if you need to do that. Yes, we are going to be sharing this PowerPoint with everybody. No worries there. Yeah. And feel free, as I said, to ping us during the week and let us know how it's going. All
right. Thank you all, and thanks for man. I talk to these budget directors and CFOs these days, and you guys are busy. So thanks for taking a little time to to pop your head up and think about some tools to help productively work through this crisis. All right, thanks everyone. Bye.